Good morning again. Our scripture today that we are looking at, and the one that was just read by Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie, so much for your leadership, for the music, and for reading the scripture. This is one of the favorite scriptures that people have in the Bible. It's always been actually my favorite. It's a dramatic story about how Jesus saves this woman who is on the brink of being killed for her sin. Now, it's a story that technically we label an agrapha. And the agrapha is a story that was primarily transmitted orally by the early church. It seems there's evidence that oral traditions, we know all the Gospels began as oral traditions and oral stories, and it seemed to be that the case that they would take notes and notes of the lectures as these stories were passed on. And contrary to the claims of some scholars, especially on YouTube, which is really not a great source of information on religion or Christianity, contrary to what you may often hear on there, they were very, very diligent about what they recorded, making it very cautious notes about what was said by Jesus and what was done by the early church community. Since it's a story that we've all heard a million times before, it's one of the most popular stories in the Bible, many of us are familiar with this story. We've heard it a million times. But it could be that we miss some key important points. So many Bible stories are not meant to just be interpreted in one way. We often think that Bible stories have one point. No, they actually were written in a complex way so that you could read them over and over and over and find different angles to the story. That was good Hebrew literature, and that was good divine writing. And so these stories are meant to be looked at from different number of angles. And so when we read this story, we often associate it as a story about a woman who's guilty. They're going to kill her, and Jesus comes to save the day at the last moment. And of course, that is part of the story, and that is a true thing that occurs in the story. However, there's some things that we sometimes would see if we looked at it from a different angle. We can also see, for instance, that this story is the story of supposedly these really good religious leaders, these very holy religious leaders, using a woman as a tool to trap Jesus and to get them both killed. In other words, it's a story about how Jesus did not come to earth to teach religion, but to bring freedom. Let me repeat that. Jesus did not come to earth to teach religion, but to bring freedom. And that's a mistake that a lot of Christians and non-Christians make when they think of Jesus, that he's here to be a religious teacher. No, he's here to bring us freedom. Now, a lot of people in the modern world think that religion is a dirty word. Religion is a bad thing. Religion is bad for society. Religion is a weapon that is used to hurt people. Religion is something that starts wars. Well, religion certainly can be destructive, and especially when religion becomes about preserving human institutions. But religion, as the reason for war, is really not the case. That's kind of a myth. In fact, the reason we have wars is not so much religion. The times of war throughout history where religion was the cause of war amounts to about 4%. 4%. The primary reason that wars are fought around the world and throughout human history is fighting over resources. Resources in land like rivers, like ports, access to ports, oceans, access to oceans, reservoirs, good cropland. Russia invading Ukraine in 2014, that was an attempt by the Russians to take over Crimea. Why did they take over Crimea? Because they needed that area to establish a naval base that they could move their navy into the Black Sea. Those are the kind of things that actually wars usually come about because of. Now, often I have friends that are not Christians that'll tell me something like, I don't like religion. Well, I always say, yeah. You know who else didn't like religion? Jesus. Yeah, Jesus didn't like religion either. And they're very surprised because they associate Jesus with religion, and Christianity is a religion, and Jesus is Christ. And so they think, oh yeah, Jesus is all about religion. But then I point out to them that in the Bible, Jesus interacts with so many different people and so many different sinners, so many people who have done so many things wrong. And it seems like the only time in the Bible when Jesus gets very angry and loses his temper is when he's dealing with religious people of his own faith who are looking down on other people. In other words, people that are using religion as a weapon. Arrogant religiosity makes Jesus very angry. And this story is a story of a group of religious leaders who think they're very, very holy, and they are trying to use a woman to try and kill Jesus. They don't care about her. They don't care about her human life. They know she may die in this process. They don't care. What they're interested in is to get rid of the threat to their institutional power, to their power as religious leaders, and to get revenge on Jesus. Now, in these verses leading up to this scripture, in the Gospel of John, we can see that Jesus is being intentionally harassed by these religious leaders. In fact, in chapter 7, we read that Jesus has actually had to alter his walking route in order to stay safe because he is being hunted. We see that in John chapter 7, verses 1 and John 7:10, for those of you that would like to look it up. But when he goes to Judea for the festival of the booths, which is when this scripture takes place, there is still a contingent of Jews that are following him, wanting to get him in trouble. They're trying to hunt him down. And it's because we are told in chapter 7, verses 12 through 13, that people were very divided over Jesus. Some thought he was wonderful, maybe he's the Messiah, maybe he's a great guy, he's a great teacher, and there were others who thought he was a fraud. And what we are told is that at this particular time in this clash, the people were tense and afraid. So it seems like things are coming to a head between those who think Jesus is good, those who think Jesus is bad. And now Jesus is kind of walking into a trap. Why? Because he's going to attend the Festival of the Booths, which is also known as the Festival of Tabernacles, which is usually maybe what we hear more often than booths. We hear the word tabernacles. And that comes from Leviticus chapter 23, Numbers 29, and Deuteronomy 16. So if you want to learn about these feasts, you can go there. Well, what I can tell you is that these are the last of the 7 great feasts prescribed, and it's one of 3, along with Pentecost and Passover, that all Jewish men were attended to require, according to Deuteronomy 16, verses 16 through 17. So all men had to be there. So Jesus had to be there. And so Jews and Jewish men would gather from all around the region, not just in Palestine, but all around the region, to live in a tent outside the temple for a week. Why would they do that? They would do that to remember that they were once wanderers in the desert and that that God provided for them in the desert. And this was a way of remembering how they were once delivered. And so out there they are camping by the temple, and they do it all week. And on the 8th day, when they get to the 8th day, that is the holiest day. It becomes a Sabbath day. And on a Sabbath day, there was no work allowed by any Jewish man. No work was allowed. That was the last great offering of the week, the highlight of the week. And another interesting thing about this festival of booths, and of the tabernacle was that it was open to anybody of any religion. Now that's interesting because remember, as I have said over and over in many of my sermons, this message of God, this gospel is meant to be global. And so as we read the Old Testament and New Testament, if we look closely, we're going to always find these little moments where there's something there for the people that are not God's chosen people. This is a pattern we see over and over, and it's very, very important to take note of that. So Jesus goes to the temple, and he decides to preach there. It's been dangerous getting there. He had to be very careful to get there, but he actually now is boldly preaching by the temple where all the Jews are and where all the religious leaders are. So this is a perfect opportunity to trap Jesus. There's going to be many people around, many pious Jews, and they're going to see that Jesus is a fraud. Furthermore, because it was a major festival, there were extra Roman guards on duty. So it's not just all these Jews and all these people, but extra Romans watching Jesus. This could get Jesus into even more trouble with the Roman leaders. Good. That's the point. We want to see him captured by everyone at one time. And then this Jesus guy who's wandering around, he keeps talking and acting like he thinks he is God or something. And that's completely offensive. That's blasphemy for Jesus to be talking this way. In John 7, verses 37 through 38, Jesus says this, which is totally inappropriate. He says, "On the last day of the feast, the great day, he stood up and said, 'If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water.'" Well, for them, and when everybody knew their Bible inside out, what this sounds like to them is that Jesus is equating himself with God. And they're probably thinking back to Isaiah 55, where it says, "Come everyone who thirsts, come to the waters." So Jesus is using scriptural language and scriptural imagery to say that he is God. He is the source of the fulfillment of Scripture. That he is the very law of God come to life. That's not okay to say that. So this is great. This is the perfect opportunity to trap Jesus. We have Jesus present. We have Jesus quoting Scripture in a strange way in front of people. We have a large crowd of pious Jews around the temple. We have Roman soldiers on patrol, listening and watching to everything. And this is the holiest moment of the festival, the holiest moment of the week. It's even a Sabbath. This is the perfect time to do something that gets Jesus in a lot of trouble. Well, what they need, though, is to get this Jesus guy to reel in this big fish. What they need is a bait. They need a bait. They need somehow to trap him. So what they decide to do is use a woman. They set kind of a trap, a bear trap. And she's the meat, or she's the honey that's going to be drawn into the trap and killed along with Jesus. So the woman is an expendable pawn. Yeah, she's probably going to die, and who cares? We're just trying to get Jesus. If someone dies as we're trying to get Jesus, who cares? That's the attitude of these religious leaders. She's going to be a casualty in this plan. But since she's guilty of sin, and Jesus is guilty of sin, who cares? They may both end up dying here, and that's all the better. In fact, it's like killing two birds with one stoning. Now, this woman is apparently, they say, guilty of terrible sin. She was caught with a man that is not her husband. And the penalty for that was death by stoning. Now, Jesus, he's going to have to admit and uphold that that is the punishment, Mosaic law. He's not a real Jew unless he says that the punishment for this woman should be death. But once she declares that she must die, he's going to get in trouble with the Romans because he's not allowed to do a death sentence. They can arrest him and kill him for proclaiming a death sentence. So this is a great trap. This is a great trap. If he declares her innocent and says, let's not kill her, well, then he's a false teacher. He says he's the law. He says he's God. He says he's the law incarnate. Oh, and then he doesn't even follow the law, and he apparently doesn't even know the law. Well, that's convenient. So Jesus was used to people who cared more about institutional religion and laws than about showing God's love and setting them free. Jesus was getting used to always being hounded, always chased, always people trying to trap him, and always people putting the law above any human heart. Jesus would say, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eyes? In other words, how can you be such a religious hypocrite? You're so concerned about other people's sins, and you're not even conscious of your own. That's a pretty good definition right there of religion. So concerned about other people's sins, not even conscious of your own. It's self-delusion. Religion is all about self-preservation. Faith is about humility, salvation, and freedom. So in verse 5, the moment for the trap arrives. It says in verse 5, now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say, Jesus? Trap, trap, trap. Should Jesus declare that stoning is necessary, or should he violate the religious law? Now let's talk a little bit about this punishment of stoning, because it's something that we as Christians often don't really understand how that worked. When we look at stoning, or we think about stoning, we think, wow, what a terrible, barbaric law. That's really a horrible way to kill someone, and you kill someone for these laws, and it's very cruel. What's interesting about the stoning, though, is that it was actually kind of a smart punishment that really cut down on crime. Why? Because stoning was very, very strict. It was easy to scare people because people didn't want to be stoned. It was a death penalty, so it cut down on sin. However, and this is the part we often miss when we read our Bibles, however, it was not an easy punishment to pull off. It wasn't just easy to say, stone him, she did this. Stone him, she did that, which is how we kind of view it in the modern world. Stonings were actually punishments with checks and balances. It was not easy to just accuse someone you don't like, or someone you got into a fight with, or someone who said something religious that you don't like, and to stone them, everybody. It wasn't that easy. The way the system was designed, it actually made it quite difficult. First of all, to stone someone, it required that there be at least 2 witnesses. At least 2 witnesses before the person was found guilty. It's kind of funny because these Pharisees who say that they know the law, but Jesus doesn't know the law, apparently don't know the law enough to know that they should have brought the man too. They left out the man. It's just the woman. That's kind of convenient. So they don't know the law as much as they think they do, but they're accusing Jesus of not knowing the law. All right, so you had to have 2 witnesses. And then it required that the accuser, the person saying, we need to stone him, we need to stone them, they had to put their hand on the person that was going to be killed and stoned in front of everyone, clearly showing, I'm the one who's making the charge that's going to kill this human being. And then after that, they had to throw the first stone at the victim or the guilty person. They didn't get away with just accusing. They had to be the ones to throw the first stone. Then they had to convince all the elders, the respected elders with the great reputations that they have in these ancient Near Eastern societies and tribes. They had to convince them, you are all the ones who are going to throw the next stones. So their reputation is at stake if they're stoning people wrong or unjustly. And then after that, everyone else would need to join in from the stoning. Everyone else in the community. And remember, these were small communities. These were very, very small communities where everyone knew each other, like our church. This is probably the size of the community of most of the communities. So if we were to kill someone right now, everyone would know it, and you would have to participate. That's not easy to do. It's not easy to kill someone you know. Think about that. How hard would it be to kill someone you've watched and grown up? Maybe they did something wrong, but they're part of your community. You've watched them grow up. Their kids go to school together and play Nintendo together, whatever. It's not easy. That's how this punishment was designed. So you were asking everyone to participate. And we know that soldiers, even today, have to be desensitized to do a killing. So it was not easy to get people to stone someone. So there's far less stonings in the Bible than we think. There are even far less stonings that occur in the Islamic kingdoms than we think throughout history. It's actually a very effective way to cut down on crime and false accusations. And there are societies, and I'm thinking of some in Africa, where you can just accuse someone you don't like of something and then they get punished, killed, or banished. So like you gossip about someone, what you're saying is not even true, but you don't like them, and then they actually get taken away forever. So that's another system that is even much worse because there's no trial, there's no accountability really. Today, we really only see stonings in places that have been taken over by places with no constitutional government of any sort. And so I'm talking like places like where ISIS is or where the Taliban are. They're not even really states. They're just kind of barbaric tribes that practice stoning against women. So it's not something that is as common as we thought. Another thing to remember is when the stoning law came about in the Bible, people didn't live in cities. These were tribes on the run from the Egyptians. They did not have jails. They did not have buildings. They did not have a lot of food. They did not have a lot of water. So when someone sinned, they couldn't just bring that person along forever. And so punishments were very harsh because the community was at risk when someone sinned. And the community was at risk if you were to try and continue to feed that person that was in the community. So all that to say, they didn't have the same resources, money, food, land, and institutions that we have when we create our death penalties, if we have death penalties. It wasn't that kind of time. So the point is that this is a 3,000-year-old solution to a problem, and we often look at it in a modern way. We look at what we have here today, and then we judge them on the kinds of laws that they had 3,000 years ago. So the religious leaders are trying to get Jesus responsible for declaring a stoning. Now, they could have asked him a hypothetical question. Okay, they could have just asked a question and trapped him that way. But no, they bring in a live human being to get sacrificed, the woman. The woman is flesh and blood, and she is a pawn. They don't care about her life. And her life is in the hands of these men. And what she doesn't know is that, ironically, actually it's God himself, Jesus, who is weighing her sin, weighing her punishment, and weighing her life. She doesn't know that she's actually being judged in front of God. Now, the funny thing is that the Pharisees, who are acting completely evil in this passage, they don't understand that God himself is there, weighing their sin their punishment, and their lives and how they practice their religion. It's very ironic here. Verse 6, it says, Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground, and as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. He bent down, wrote on the ground, and when they heard that, they went away one by one. And notice, beginning with the older ones, the wise ones, till everyone was gone. So Jesus bends down and writes something on the ground. Now, why would Jesus write in the sand? Isn't that such a weird part of the story? Why would he write on the sand? What a strange thing. The reason he wrote on the sand is because it was the Sabbath day, remember? It was the holiest day. And it turns out that Jews were not allowed to write on the Sabbath. They could not write on the Sabbath because that was considered work. Writing was defined as putting something permanent on something, like a papyrus or something. So what Jesus does is he writes on something that's impermanent. Sand. Ha ha ha. So what did Jesus start to write? Well, all week they've been accusing him of thinking that he is God and that he doesn't know the law. So it seems like Jesus is actually trolling them. He's trolling them by referring back to something from Exodus chapter 31, verses 18, which says, "When the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of the covenant law, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God." So they're accusing Jesus, who is God, of not knowing the law that he created. So Jesus, who is God, is writing the law in front of them again. It's ironic. It's funny. I mean, he's making fun of them at this point, actually. So what did Jesus actually write? Well, a common opinion is that the first time that he was writing the punishment, he wrote the law of Moses, which is what should happen to the woman? Death. But remember, Jesus is God incarnate. And why is he God incarnate? He's God incarnate because he is here on earth to overcome death and overcome sin by offering the forgiveness of sins to everyone. So he is actually only a few weeks away from being the ultimate sacrifice for her sins. She doesn't know that. The temple priests don't know that, but Jesus knows that. He knows that he is the one who is going to be sentenced to death, not on that day. And all of this is occurring outside the temple walls, not far from a little place outside the temple walls called Golgotha. In verse 7 it says, and they continued to ask him. He stood up and said to them, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And once more he bends down on the ground. Now, what did he write the second time when he wrote on the ground? Well, there are hardly any acts of writing, actually, in the whole Bible. There's only 3 acts of actual writing in the Bible. First is Exodus, when God writes on the stone. Then in Daniel, when God writes on the wall. And then here, when Jesus writes on the ground. Jeremiah 17, verses 13 says, "O Lord, the hope of Israel, all that forsake thee shall be ashamed, and that they depart from me shall be written in the earth, because they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living waters." Now, most people speculate that what Jesus wrote down in the sand there was the sins of all the people present. Their secrets. The secret women that they were with. The commandments that they had broken. All of their sins. Because what we notice is that once he starts writing and they see what he's written, they leave immediately. It's as if something has shamed them very, very quickly. And it was the custom in those days, as I said, that it was the elders who threw the first stones. And guess what? They're the ones that first leave. They walk away first. Verse 9 makes it apparent that they really cleared out quickly after whatever it was that he wrote. Something shamed them. But the mystery of the story of what did Jesus do in that moment, that's not the core point of the story. Neither is even the guilt of this woman the thrust of this story. Nor even the liberation of this woman by Jesus. Although that is a crucial aspect of the story, it's clearly a beautiful story of grace. And that's why it's many people's favorite. But this scripture, I believe, is designed to make us believers, us Christians, and us holy people rein in our judgment of others. To stop our condescension. To stop putting God into a box about how he's supposed to save people and what he's supposed to do and how he judges and who he judges. Jesus has an abundance of patience in the gospel for sinners. He has an abundance of patience in the gospel for sinners. Jesus, however, has zero patience with religious hypocrites. That's the thing that makes Jesus lose his temper. Religious hypocrites. And religion can be about sanctimony. It can be about deciding who is in and who is out, who's part of the club, who's not part of the club, who gets saved and who doesn't get saved, about looking down on large swaths of people, about seeking privilege and being in a privileged position. Religion can be dangerous. But Christian spirituality, Christ-like spirituality, is rooted in humility and grace. Christian faith is about acknowledging that we are both the woman in this story and we are also the religious leaders in this story. That, as Paul said, all fall short of the glory of God. The more we experience grace in our lives, the less we feel comfortable judging as Christians. The more we become aware of our brokenness and our sin, the more we have compassion and mercy on other people. And there are a lot of religious people in our world and in our churches that are not broken. They are not broken. They feel very entitled to judge others. But that's not what Christian spirituality is about. The more we understand grace, the less religious we become. A church that teaches grace is a happy place. A church that teaches religion is a broken place. And the world is desperate to see Christians live out their faith in humility. And so often we can forget how close we are to being like these religious leaders that were trying to trap Jesus. We don't try to trap Jesus as if we're going to capture him and crucify him. We capture Jesus by saying, this is what you can do in the church and this is what you can't. This is who you can save. This is who you can't. This is who's redeemable. This is who's not redeemable. That's the way we do it. To conclude a little story, once upon a time, there was a donkey that was going down a street. And one day, as he was going down the street, everyone was cheering and clapping, and they were waving palms as he went down the street. The donkey felt so good about himself. Wow, I'm really, really important. Everyone's cheering. They're waving palms. He went to his mother and he told her all about it. I walked down this street and everyone was cheering for me. Everyone loved me. Everyone was waving palms. It was so great. Well, then the next day, the donkey went back to that same street, walked down that street, and nothing happened. No one was looking at him. No one was waving palm trees. No one was cheering. Nothing was happening. The donkey went home and he was confused. He complained to his mother. And he said, "Mom, I went back down that street today and nobody was cheering for me. No one was clapping. No one was waving palms." And his mother said to him, "Oh, son, don't you know that you are not anything without Jesus Christ?" So just like the donkey, who didn't realize that what made him great was that he was carrying Jesus on his back, we have to be careful to understand always that we are nothing without Jesus Christ. And that brings us to tremendous, tremendous humility. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. We're going to go into a time of communion. And it's a moment where we take the Lord's Supper together as one body. We remember that Christ's incarnation and crucifixion and resurrection historically occurred. And by the baptism of his suffering, death, and resurrection,